Good evening. I'd like to welcome all of you here at the chapel and all of those out there who are live streaming into our presentation this evening. My name is Jim Brown. I'm a member of Bellarmine Chapel here, and I'm also been on the planning team for the Embracing God series that we've been conducting these last 9 months in collaboration with all the members of our Jesuit family here in Cincinnati, Bellarmine Chapel, St. Xavier Parish, Xavier University's Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice, St. Xavier High School, the Jesuit Spiritual Center in Milford, and the newly formed Xavier Jesuit Academy in Bon Hill. The Embracing God's creation series is grounded in both Pope Francis' encyclical Laudato Si, and Care for Our Common Home, and the Global Society of Jesus 2019 Universal Apostolic Preference, number 4, which is entitled Caring for Our Common Home. Again, thank you for joining us. This is the last presentation of our series, and it'll be presented by Dr. John Sagaki, and the title is Climate Change, What Do We Do Now? Responding Faithfully to the Call of Laudato Si. And as we have done each of our presentations, we begin with this beautiful prayer from Laudato Si by Pope Francis. So just take a second to take a deep breath and join us in prayer. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as sisters and brothers, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us tonight. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. Amen. This evening, Dr. Sagaki will share with us, thank you. Will share with us for about 45 minutes, and then we'll break in, it's been our custom, into small groups. And after the small group sharing, we'll have a question and answer period. For those of you who are watching the live stream and previously RSVP'd, you should have received a Zoom link via email. When we go into discussion groups, we invite you to log into the Zoom link for your small group discussion. If you didn't receive the link, it is available beneath the YouTube video in the live stream description. The slides for tonight are also there in case you're having trouble seeing them on your screen. With that, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. John. John received his BA in Peace and Global Studies from Earlham College and an MA and PhD in Christian Ethics from the University of Notre Dame. He has taught in the theology department here at Xavier since 2001. John's main areas of interest include Catholic social teaching, globalization, the ethics of war and nonviolence, grassroots social movements, ecology, food ethics, contemplative spirituality, and Buddhist-Christian dialogue. He is the author of Catholic Social Teaching and Economic Globalization, The Quest for Alternatives. John serves as director of the undergraduate Peace and Justice Studies minor and is the co-director of the Institute for Spirituality and Social Justice, the theology graduate program here on campus. Welcome, John, and thank you.
Thank you. I think I'm up. So I think I'm wired here. Yes, you can hear me okay? Yeah. So thank you all for being here tonight. I realize coming out a discussion of climate change may not be the most exciting thing to do, but it is, of course, such a crucial issue, and I appreciate your being here. I realize that's also sometimes an issue that's hard to talk about, so hopefully we'll be able to have some good conversation after the presentation, both in our small groups and then in the larger group setting. For those of us who are Catholic, it's important to understand that the issue of climate change has been being talked about in the church for a long time. Many Catholics don't know that necessarily, but it's true. So back in 1990, Pope John Paul II spoke of climate change, or he used the language of the greenhouse effect. But he highlighted it over 30 years ago as one of the most pressing ethical issues that the world was facing. And more broadly, he had this to say about the centrality of ecological concern to Catholic faith. He said, "Today, the ecological crisis has assumed such proportions as to be the responsibility of everyone. Christians in particular realize that their responsibility within creation and their duty towards nature and the Creator are an essential part of their faith." So really grounding it right in the core of Catholic faith. And this was, of course, reaffirmed by Pope Benedict, who is actually often referred to as the Green Pope, who put some solar panels on the Vatican and had a forest planted to try to offset carbon emissions and trying to become the first carbon neutral state in the world. And so there's a history here prior to Francis, but Francis certainly has intensified that attention with Laudato Si, and certainly has gotten a lot more media focus on it than you maybe had with the previous popes. So I wasn't sure how much background people had on the issue of climate change itself, so we're going to do kind of a quick run through some of the basics, and then get into the what can we do questions, and are there signs of hope amidst the difficult situation that I'll be describing in the first part. But often when we think about climate change or see images, we might think of something like this, right? So the polar bear. And one might hope that people would be concerned inherently for the well-being of polar bears, and that might lead them to take action. But there's also ways perhaps that this image maybe not be the most helpful, right? It gives a sense that climate change is something happening up there somewhere, right? And to some creatures that we might care about, but aren't necessarily going to change our daily lives in response to. And so I think the question is, how do we get people to have different images in their mind when we think about climate change? And so I like to use this image, which those of you who knew John David when he was little, he's big, he's back there now, about as tall as I am. But I just love this picture. It's a very cute picture of him. But how do we get people to think of their children, as one of the first things that comes to mind when they think about climate change, recognizing that, the entire world is going to be different, that our children are growing up into in all its various dimensions. And so thinking of images like that, or perhaps even more appropriate would be an image of children from sub-Saharan Africa, which has certainly been the area of the world most hard hit by the realities of climate change so far, or one of the most hard hit, and yet likely the area that has had least responsibility for causing it. And we'll see that's one of the kinds of ethical dynamics of climate change, is that the greatest impacts are often felt, at least in the short term, by those who've been least responsible. But just some of the basics in terms of understanding that there is a scientific consensus around several basic facts. And so one way to state that is that there is no national or international scientific body that disputes three basic facts. And so this would be like all the national academies of science, and all the countries that have it, all the national, international associations of biologists, chemists, physicists have signed on to these statements affirming these three things. That the Earth is warming, right? We can measure it. I'll show you some charts in a minute that'll show that. That humans' activities are the major causative factor. So sometimes you'll hear people say, what about sunspots? Or what about other things? And clearly climate scientists have taken all of this into account. They've also been able to study the chemical and physical properties of carbon dioxide and methane and things like that, and know that it holds in heat, right? So the more you put that into the atmosphere, the more heat you're going to have. And then the third is that the consequences will be, and have already begun to be, profoundly negative. It's only on this one that there will be some diversity in terms of like really bad, really, really, really bad, or absolutely catastrophic, and how soon. I mean, that's where the scientific debate is, not is climate change happening, is it human caused? And we'll talk more about notions of tipping points and things like that a bit later. But just a few charts showing temperature rise over time. You can see there's some ups and downs, and some of it has to do with like El Nino and La Nina and things. So it doesn't mean as the Earth is warming that it's necessarily sequentially warmer every single year, but just that the overall trajectory is clearly sharply upward, as we see there. That one just goes up to about 2010, so there's another one that brings us up more to the present, with each dot representing a year, or if you like, other kinds of graphs. So that one, so going back over 140 years or so, you can see all the most recent years are at the top of that chart. So one way of saying this is that the first decade of this century was by far the warmest decade since modern records began, according to the World Meteorological Organization. And then the next decade was even warmer, setting a new record. 22 of the 23 hottest years ever recorded have all been since 2001, which is another way of saying every year since 2001 has been one of the 23 hottest years ever recorded. The 23rd is 1996. In the last 9 years are the 9 hottest years ever recorded. So it's clear that the Earth is warming. It's clear that the seas are warming as well. And so the question is, well, what are some of the consequences? Some of these I think we're immediately familiar with. Some we might not think as much about. I think everyone thinks about the melting of glaciers, sea level rise, and already some small island nations that are having to relocate their population because of the sea level rise. Changes in rainfall patterns, drought in many places, excessive rain and flooding in others. And so one of the important things to understand about climate change is it doesn't necessarily result in the exact same things everywhere, right? It's more climate chaos, climate disruption, pushing things to extremes, but it can be extremes of drought, it can be extremes of excess moisture, in some places one following the other. So I'm sure you're familiar with the floods in Pakistan this past year that submerged about a third of the entire country of Pakistan. That had been preceded by some very severe drought as well. And in general, increased extreme weather events, stronger hurricanes, stronger monsoons. As temperatures get warmer and drier, increased forest fires, which of course creates a cycle, right? So as the forests burn, releases more carbon that contributes to more heating. And so we'll talk about some of those kind of feedback loops. All these things, floods, droughts, increasing temperature, can cause significant harm to agriculture. And again, sub-Saharan Africa especially hard hit. Central America as well. In recent years, drought and the inability of small farmers to maintain their livelihood has been one of the driving forces of immigration to the United States, combined with, of course, the history of US installation and support of repressive governments, and combined with the negative impacts of free trade policies that have especially devastated small farmers. The farmers have been even worse hit now by climate change. Water shortages, so as less snow accumulates in the mountains, and especially in the areas of the world like the Andes or the Himalayas, where people depend upon the melt from the mountains for their water supplies, you have less accumulating and faster runoff and flooding and things rather than a gradual, percolation to refill the groundwater. And so it's estimated that the world, maybe a decade ago, about a third of the world was in water stress conditions. It's expected that that'll rise to about 2/3 of the world within the next couple decades. Many analysts think there'll be more conflict over water than over fossil fuels as we move into the coming years. All of this, of course, contributes to widespread species extinction. Scientists tell us we're in the midst of the 6th mass extinction on Earth, this one being the first that's primarily human-caused. But also deep impacts on oceans. Yes, Sue? I can use the handheld. Where is it? Okay, is that better? Okay, great. So the impacts, oops, that wasn't supposed to happen. I'm not sure. Hey, my tech support is here. I don't think I did anything. You're welcome. Thank you. Having an 18-year-old is very helpful in many different ways. But the impacts on the oceans, so the destruction of coral reefs through bleaching, acidification, and the ocean really has been absorbing a lot of the carbon dioxide. Temperature on land would be even higher if it wasn't for the ocean absorbing so much of it, but it's reaching a saturation point where it can't continue to keep doing that. Increased spread of disease as temperatures change, organisms can move into new areas and spread disease to places where it may not have been before. All these things can contribute to increased environmental refugees and increased conflict. And so many conflicts in the world, including in the last few days, hearing about the conflicts in Sudan, places like Somalia, places like Syria. There's deep environmental factors that are one of multiple factors that are contributing to those conflicts. So we're already seeing that. And one of the organizations that has highlighted these dangers and the impacts of climate change is the Pentagon. So has issued reports referring to climate change as one of the gravest national security issues that we face. So this is from a report from a couple years ago. Rising global temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, climbing sea levels, and more extreme weather events will intensify the challenges of global instability, hunger, poverty, and conflict. They will likely lead to food and water shortages, pandemic disease, disputes over refugees and resources, and destruction by natural disasters in regions across the globe. And they stress, of course, that this kind of disruption will lead to the conditions where extremist groups of various kinds can flourish. The greatest fear of climate change, of climate scientists, with regard to climate change, is the danger of feedback loops. And you may have some familiarity with this, but especially of concern is all the methane that's stored under the Arctic permafrost, right? So as temperatures warm, permafrost begins to melt, that methane begins to get released. Methane, one of the most potent greenhouse gases, leads to more warming, more release, and a concern that if that becomes kind of an unstoppable spiral, that that's kind of the worst case scenario in terms of habitability of the planet moving forward. There are other kinds of tipping points as well. As ice melts and darker surfaces become exposed, you don't reflect as much of the solar radiation back into space. That also contributes to greater warming and more melting and the like. Some of the ethics of climate change I've already touched upon, but mainly the fact that the world's richest people and countries have done the most, contributed to the most damage, but it's often the poorest countries that are experiencing the worst impacts. So it's estimated the richest 7% of the world's population currently responsible for about half of the world's carbon dioxide emissions, but the most negative consequences being experienced by the world's poor. And of course, a central theme of Laudato Si is Pope Francis's assertion that we need to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, and to understand how deeply interconnected both of those are. He says it's not two separate crises. It's one interconnected crisis being caused by the same global system, and we need to see it as such and see the need for some very fundamental changes. This is a look at carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. You'll see that there is some natural variation over the last 800 years, but always within a fairly well-defined range, really never getting over 300 parts per million. We are now at, you can see in the bottom there, 421 parts per million. So we are well beyond anything that has been experienced on this planet in at least the last 800,000 years. We're essentially living in a new climate. And those numbers continue to rise at about 2 parts per million per year. Climate scientists have conversation about what is the maximum safe level. And several years ago, a bunch of scientists put out a report saying probably around 350. So if you're familiar with the organization 350.org, which is one of the organizations listed on your handout, that's where they got the name from, is wanting to try to educate people about this level of carbon dioxide concentrations. And again, we're at 421 and rising, so we not only need to stop increasing, but need to find ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere if we want to get back down to what scientists argue are the kind of safe level. And important to see that climate change is occurring even faster than predicted by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. When the reports come out, they're often attacked as being, extremist, overestimates or whatever, but in fact, they've generally been found to be very conservative in their estimates, and that things have actually gotten worse more quickly than the reports have stated. So all this leads to a lot of people and organizations expressing the urgency of taking action. So a quote from the United Nations Development Program: "There is now overwhelming scientific evidence that the world is moving towards the point at which irreversible ecological catastrophe becomes unavoidable. There is a window of opportunity for avoiding the most damaging climate change impacts, but that window is closing." And others have said very similar things. James Hansen, probably the most well-known US climate scientist, he was the director of NASA's climate science division, had this to say, not the most scientific language here, but I think you'll get the idea. He says, "We're toast if we don't get on a very different path. This is the last chance." Rajendra Pachauri, former chair of the IPCC, says similarly. "What we do in the next few years will determine our future. This is the defining moment. We still have time to build a better, more sustainable world, but we have precious little of that time." And that's broadly what the scientific community is telling us. That yes, it's not too late, but we need to make very radical changes very quickly if we're going to avoid these tipping points and kind of runaway, climate catastrophe. Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, you may be familiar with their doomsday clock, which originally was especially developed in relation to nuclear war, but in recent years, they've also taken into account climate change. And so in 2020, especially with regard to the issue of climate change, they moved it closer to midnight than they have ever had it before, saying that it's the most dangerous situation that humanity has ever faced. We face a true emergency, an absolutely unacceptable state of world affairs that has eliminated any margin for error or further delay. And then this beginning of this past year, both as a result of inadequate action on climate change and, of course, increased tensions between the US and Russia and nuclear concerns, they moved it even closer to midnight. So lots of folks expressing grave concern in the scientific community. And Pope Francis certainly joining those voices, understands the depth of the crisis that we're facing. He wrote a letter to climate change negotiators saying, "What you're going to debate affects the whole of humanity, in particular the poorest and future generations." And those kinds of deep ethical concerns for the poor and for future generations always at the heart of Francis's reflections on this issue. He says the time to find global solutions is running out. Hence, there is a clear, definitive, and ineluctable ethical imperative to act. And he went so far as to say in another statement, I can say to you now or never, every year the problems are getting worse. We are at the limits. If I may use a strong word, I would say that we are on the verge of suicide. And so that was a comment made right before the Paris Climate Accord final stage negotiations in 2015, highlighting the necessity of reaching an agreement at that conference to at least keep open the possibility of avoiding these worst impacts. So all these warnings are coming and leads us to the question of why not more attention to climate change. For the sake of time, I'm actually going to skip over this, but we can come back to it in the conversation that we have later. But something to think about. I mean, what do you see as the factors that are hindering the action that the scientists are saying is needed, the action that religious leaders like Pope Francis, other religious leaders are telling us is needed? You know, we've seen until last year, US Congress basically do nothing on the issue of climate change. What they did last year was very significant, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But so the question of why not more attention we can come back to. But I wanted us to get to are there signs of hope? Where is there hope? And the what can we do questions, both in terms of public policy, but also in terms of individual lifestyle choices and the like. So where is there hope? I would say we can see it in a number of places. And one is certainly the activism of young people around the world. You probably recognize there Greta Thunberg, who began her climate strike literally as one person sitting outside the Swedish parliament. And it's grown into a movement where on some of their climate strikes there have been several million young people all around the world who've joined in. The COVID pandemic took some of the momentum out of that, but they're beginning their actions again. Oops. This young man, there's actually one of the resources that I list on the handout is a very powerful, I think it's about 9 or 10 minute talk that he gave to the United Nations at the age of 15. And it's really one of the most powerful presentations on climate change that I've heard. So I encourage you to consider giving it a watch. He's an indigenous man from Colorado and has been a leading activist organizing young people on climate change issues. And one other thing that he's been involved with is the climate lawsuit that children have filed against the federal government and also in various state levels, basically arguing that their constitutional rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness are being undermined by the failure of policymakers to take adequate action on climate change. They've had mixed results in their legal cases. In some cases, I think it was in the state of Washington State, I believe, the judge ruled in their favor and ordered the governor to come up with a stronger plan to address climate change. Some of the other ones have been thrown out. The federal case has been going around in circles for many years, but I think it has done a lot to raise publicity about the issue and to see young people so concerned about the realities of climate change. We also see that in activism at various colleges and universities, the divestment movement, trying to get institutions to divest from their investments in fossil fuels. So this is Georgetown. So back in 2020, Georgetown announced fossil fuel divestment. Does anybody know what the first Catholic institution, higher education institution to do it was? It was the University of Dayton. Actually, was the first Catholic university in the country to divest from fossil fuels. This is a demonstration of students at Creighton, where they were also successful in getting commitments to at least a significant amount of divestment. I would argue hope in Catholic social teaching, right? That the contribution of Pope Francis, Laudato Si, which he timed to come out right before that final stage of the Paris Climate Accords, even many non-Catholics say, this was very significant. It helped focus the world's attention on some of the underlying moral issues, try to get it out of just political partisan way of thinking about it. And it's certainly impacting Catholic institutions. So just within the last few years, or last year or so, there's been a call for Catholic institutions to develop a Laudato Si action plan, right? So Bellarmine Chapel has done that, Xavier University is doing that, many other Catholic institutions are doing that. To be seen how much that is simply rhetoric or how much it gets followed through with concrete actions, but you at least have an attempt to hold Catholic institutions accountable to this encyclical, not just having it be there as an interesting thing to read, but saying how are we structuring this into the life of our institutions. And you can see him there, Pope Francis there meeting with Greta Thunberg. Hope in history, just the understanding that there have been many other struggles that were seen as very challenging and potentially hopeless at certain points in time, and yet things like ending at least legal slavery, or ending the apartheid system in South Africa, and other social movements that we can take inspiration from throughout history. And some countries are doing really well in sort of modeling and showing what can be done in responding to these issues. So these next few slides are actually from a couple years ago. So when it says over the past 4 years, it was 4 years before a couple years ago. But by that time, Costa Rica had already achieved 95% renewable electricity. That's now up to, like, last figure I saw was 99.9%. So essentially entirely renewable. Other countries you might not think of as being in the forefront of things like this have been able to do similar things. Uruguay, at that time, got about 95%. I think they're up to about 98% now of their electricity from renewables. Germany, in a recent year, produced enough renewable energy in the first half of the year to power every home in the country for a whole year. Germany, one of the leaders in Western Europe in terms of the movement to renewable energy. Sweden announced its intention to become one of the first nations to go 100% fossil fuel free. Certainly not there yet, but taking strong steps in that direction. But it's not just at the national level, right? And I think when we think about taking action, like with lobbying or reaching out to representatives, certainly crucial to do that at the federal level, but also to understand that there's a lot of things that can be done at the state and local levels as well. Ohio, unfortunately, has been largely moving in the opposite direction in recent years, but some other states have modeled things that can be done. So California is certainly one of those. As of, I believe, 2020, and then with some delay because of the pandemic, but now being more enforced, they require all new home construction, business construction to incorporate solar panels into their buildings. California has already committed that they will not allow the sale of gas-powered or diesel-powered vehicles after 2035, so moving to all zero-emission vehicles, at least new vehicles. They won't take existing vehicles off the road, but you won't be able to allow to sell non-zero emission vehicles in California after 2035. They've set a goal of 90% clean energy by 2035 and 100% by 2045, and an overall goal of carbon neutrality for the state by 2045. Also things that can be done at the city level. Sometimes people living in Cincinnati are surprised to know that Cincinnati is seen as a leader in some of these efforts. So Cincinnati was one of the first cities to have a green plan, the first one back in 2008, updated every 5 years. So the newest one just released within the last several weeks. Making a variety of commitments. So reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 is the stated goal from the 2010 levels. And I believe the latest figures I saw is that it's already down by about 35 or 36%, something like that. So Cincinnati has made some significant movement in that direction. The goal of carbon neutrality by 2050 is something that was added in the most recent version of the plan. Cincinnati is building the largest city-owned solar array anywhere in the United States, 100 megawatt solar array. Through its electricity aggregation program and purchasing renewable energy and renewable energy credits, it's been able to also provide green energy for residential customers, especially throughout the city. And some interesting pilot projects. So I don't know if you know, there's a police station actually that's a net zero building in Westwood that the building produces as much energy as it consumes. So giving examples of some of the kinds of things that can be done. And so more broadly, what can we do, right? I think that's the core question that brings us here tonight is, what are things that can be done? And so obviously educating ourselves and others is the start, right? To understand the reality, to understand how to respond maybe to some of the common misconceptions that people have, and what the science is telling us. Hard to overstress the importance of activism, right? The kind of transformation that's needed to adequately respond to climate change is not something that's going to happen without a broad social movement. Pretty much all the major, improvements in society have largely come about through, social movements. Getting involved in things like demonstrations, the climate strikes that we're seeing, obviously voting for people who understand and take seriously the reality of climate change, calling policymakers, meeting in person to lobby policymakers and their staff, getting involved with things like the divestment movement, which is not only at colleges and universities, but also in other institutions. So many religious orders, for example, have divested their stock holding and things from fossil fuels. There's also a movement very much now to put pressure on the banks to stop lending for fossil fuel projects. So there's ways to get involved with those kinds of campaigns. Many have been led to feel that civil disobedience is an appropriate response in various circumstances. So climate change really, I think more than any other issue over the last few decades, has had more people arrested for civil disobedience in connection with it, especially some of the pipeline struggles like the Keystone XL pipeline, but other in other forms as well. The lawsuits like the children's lawsuit, but various other lawsuits as well that are going on can be seen as forms of important activism. Some of the kinds of policies that the activism would call for. Many argue that the carbon tax would be perhaps the most powerful thing that could be done, which would put a price on carbon emissions, require the negative impacts to be incorporated into that price, and so give more incentive to move to alternatives more quickly. And you have had this done in a variety of nations. You've had it done at the kind of state or province level in various nations as well. You haven't really seen it as something in the United States at this point. And a lot of pushback when you even talk about anything that has the word tax in it. So the Biden administration has tried a different approach that we'll talk more about. But in the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed last year, by far the strongest legislation dealing with climate change that the U.S. Congress has ever passed. It's estimated that when fully implemented, it could reduce U.S. Carbon emissions by about 40% in the coming in the coming years. So still not adequate to what's needed, but a huge step in the right in the right direction. And that's done mainly through providing various kinds of incentives, right? So there's incentives of if you install solar panels, you can take 30% of the cost of that whole system off of your taxes, and not just off of your income, but actually off of the amount of taxes that you owe. There are now incentives for buying electric vehicles, $7,500 you can get as a tax rebate for buying electric vehicles, and even with used electrical vehicles now, you can get, I think, up to $4,000. And there's some details to that in terms of vehicles being made primarily in the United States and the like, so it wouldn't necessarily apply to every electric vehicle that's out there, but a lot of money being put into trying to encourage people to move in that direction. And so that would go with the second point of supporting renewable energy, supporting solar, wind, geothermal, what I call responsible hydro. There's ways that large dams have been deeply destructive in the past, but there's also ways that hydropower can be done more responsibly. But those would be some of the main forms of renewable energy. Obviously, things like ending subsidies and tax breaks for fossil fuels would be crucial. A lot of those still exist. Increasing fuel efficiency standards for cars or stronger pollution rules. And so if you're following the news, you might have seen that the EPA just announced rules that, if they are finalized, most analysts say would lead to about 2/3 of vehicles being sold by the year 2032, so less than a decade from now, as being electric, because that would be the only way that the manufacturers could meet the stringency of the new requirements. As you can imagine, there's a lot of pushback happening. It's going to take about a year before to hear testimony and all these things and to finalize the regulations, but if they were implemented as proposed, it would have a huge impact in speeding up the transition to electric vehicles, not only cars, but also larger vehicles, mid-sized trucks, but also larger trucks, buses, things like that are all included. As we move or try to move everything to renewable energy, and most of which would be then being powered by electricity, the need to create an upgraded smart electrical grid, some of the funding that was contained in the Infrastructure Act that was passed a couple of years ago will be crucial for this, but more funding will ultimately be needed as well, but some steps are being taken in this direction. Investing in public transportation is certainly another important thing that could be done. One of the reasons that many Western European countries have a similar lifestyle to the United States, but often use maybe half as much energy per capita. A lot of that has to do with much more functional public transportation systems. Other factors as well, but that's one of them. Preventing deforestation and planting trees. Planting trees anywhere is good. Planting trees in the tropics for a variety of reasons is even better. But any tree planting can be helpful. And then providing aid to poorer nations to help them transition to alternative energy sources, increase energy efficiency. Pope Francis in Laudato Si develops the notion of ecological debt and says that the first world nations that have become rich through all this polluting, et cetera, owe an ecological debt to the other nations. And one way that can be repaid is by providing financial assistance to help them deal with the consequences of climate change, but also to help them transition to new technologies that wouldn't contribute to the same worsening of the problems. Other measures in terms of policies could be things like taking positive steps to control population growth, and I'm thinking especially here of two of the things that correlate most strongly with reduced population growth. One is the education and empowerment of women, and the other is providing greater economic equality and security. So most of the places that have high population growth rates also have high infant and child mortality, for example. And when there's greater guarantees economically, population growth rates tend to slow. And then one thing that often doesn't get talked about, but probably should, is the importance of reducing military spending. So the single institution in the world that is responsible for most greenhouse gas emissions is the US military. It is quite striking that in all of President Biden's things about setting goals for reducing emissions, it's always saying anything related to national security is exempted from those, from those rules. So being more attentive to the climate impact that plays is important. And then what else? Things we can do, and we can talk more about a lot of these things when we move to conversation. But one of the most significant, so I guess even before getting into this, the question of what's the relationship of lifestyle changes to the broader policy changes, right? So it's clear that we need the broad policy changes. We need to transform our entire energy infrastructure, et cetera, to deal adequately with the problem. And so sometimes people think, well, compared to that, what do my lifestyle changes do? Are they really going to make a difference? And I think on one hand you can recognize that no, everyone becoming vegetarian in and of itself is not going to solve climate change. But what it certainly can do is help buy us time so that we don't reach these tipping points, that we can continue to work for the deeper kind of policy changes that are needed as well. There's also, I think, the sense that the lifestyle changes show other people that you're taking an issue seriously, right? And that you're willing to change your life in response. And that just kind of social dynamics in social psychology, that often leads other people to take that issue more seriously than they would if you're saying, this is a crucial issue, but they don't see you changing anything yourself, right? So it can contribute to the kind of broader cultural changes that make the policy changes more likely to happen. And so in all these ways, the lifestyle changes really are crucially important. And some of the articles that I highlighted in the handout address these as well. But so one of the lifestyle changes that climate scientists tell us could be most significant is decreasing or eliminating our meat consumption, especially beef. So beef is the most carbon intensive of meats. Lamb would be up there too, but is less commonly eaten, at least in this country. James Hansen, who's I mentioned earlier, one of the most prominent US climate scientists, had this to say: if you eat further down on the food chain rather than animals, you can actually make a bigger contribution to greenhouse gas reduction in that way than just about anything. So that, in terms of individual action, is perhaps the best thing that you can do. Lots of other positive ecological benefits would be connected with that as well as benefits for world hunger, human health, etc. Pope Francis sort of points to this. He's actually, as you may not know, but the first pope to explicitly call for reduced meat consumption. In a letter that he wrote to young people in Europe just a few months ago, talked about that as one of the things that need to be done. But in Laudato Si, he sort of also opens up broader issues around food and animals in particular when he talks about recognizing the inherent worth, inherent value of every creature, right? So he has this to say: together with our obligation to use the earth's goods responsibly, we are called to recognize that other living beings have a value of their own in God's eyes. Everything is related, and we human beings are united as brothers and sisters on a wonderful pilgrimage, woven together by the love God has for each of his creatures. Every creature is thus the object of the Father's tenderness, who gives it its place in the world. Even the fleeting life of the least of beings is the object of his love. So Francis really calling us to a very deep sense of the sacredness of life and the importance of not taking life when we have alternatives. I mean, he doesn't necessarily himself spell out all the implications that this might have for human diet, but I think it kind of opens the space for that conversation in Catholic circles when we see these kinds of statements that are coming out. And he has at least called, again, for reducing meat consumption. In terms of other sort of big things, in terms of lifestyle changes, decreasing driving, and then especially flying. Flying is absolutely one of the most carbon-intensive things that we can ever do. There's a book that I actually have here for show and tell called Being the Change, Live Well, and Spark a Climate Revolution. It's by a climate scientist named Peter Kalmus. And making a number of changes in his life, he was able to reduce his carbon emissions to about 1/10 of the average person in the United States. And the two main things he did was to stop eating meat and to stop flying. And then he did some other things. He grew some of his own food and made other lifestyle changes, but he highlights those as the two biggest that he made. He also has an interesting companion video that goes with that that's mentioned on the handout if you want to check that out. Some of the other things, maybe not having as much impact, but crucially important as well, and pretty common sense things would be things like adjust your thermostat to save energy, minimize use of air conditioning when it's not medically necessary, turn off unnecessary lights, turn off the various things that are always in standby mode that you don't really need to have on when you're sleeping, and little things, but that can make a difference if people do them. In general, consume less when possible. Francis, of course, in Laudato Si spends a lot of time critiquing what he calls the throwaway culture, or throwaway society, and calling us to see and find the joy in living more simply. And we are nearing the end here. So invest in energy efficiency, use of alternative energy sources. So the hybrid electric cars we've already touched upon. Clearly that's where the transportation system is moving, but the question is, with all these things are moving in the right direction, right? We're moving towards solar and renewable, but the question is, are we moving fast enough, right, to avoid these various kinds of tipping points? And that's where the deep concern is, that we need to speed up the rate at which we're moving in these directions. But so things like hybrid or electric cars, purchasing energy efficient appliances, increasingly attention to switching from natural gas to electric, because again, if all the renewable forms of energy are going to be in a form of electricity, you want to have your appliances be using electricity. One of the most cost-effective things to do to save energy, of course, is to insulate your homes or other buildings well. It's of course possible now to build buildings, as we talked about with the police station, that produce more energy than they consume, right? So there's a lot of innovations in green building that hold promise for the future. People at their homes could do things like investing in solar panels, assuming you're not totally shaded by trees and such. But even if you are, there's movements to develop kind of community solar where people can join together to finance solar projects that may not be directly on their home. Investing in wind, less possible at the individual level, but in some cases can be done. Geothermal, certainly a wonderful way to reduce energy usage. Kind of cliche, but switching your light bulbs, right? So if you do still have incandescent light bulbs, switching to LEDs is a very good thing to do. Uses about 1/6 of the energy, saves you money over time, etc. And then this last one is sometimes somewhat controversial, but the purchasing of carbon offsets. Carbon offset, if you're not familiar, it's basically paying for something good to be done or something bad not to be done, right? That will have benefits for the climate. The reason it's controversial is because sometimes it's seen as like wealthy people saying, I can pollute all I want and I'll just offset my emissions. And if that's how it's being done, I mean, it's still better for a wealthy person to do that than not do that, right? But avoiding emissions that we can is the best thing to do. But we can't avoid all emissions, obviously. And so offsetting, those that are just part of living our daily lives is an important thing to do. but making sure they're well certified, right? There's a lot of bad, non-reliable carbon offset programs out there, and so you want to make sure you're dealing with a reputable one. And the cool thing about carbon offsets is that not only can they help the environment, they can often have immediate positive impacts in people's lives. So if you went to the site that I have listed there at goldstandard.org, you'll see the various things that you can invest in. But one of the ones that's often used is alternative cook stoves for people in parts of the world where coal or wood is their main source of fuel. That often has very negative health impacts right away because you're standing around it, especially on the women who spend around more, or the women who have to gather all the wood and other things. And so providing these alternative cook stoves, they could be solar cook stoves, they could just be much more efficient cook stoves that might use a tenth of the wood or whatever that the other ones had used before, will have positive benefits in terms of preventing those carbon emissions, but also have very positive impacts on people's lives in immediately as well. And so I strongly encourage you, check it out and see what's there. They estimate that the average person in the United States, I believe, is responsible for about 2 tons of carbon emissions a month. And depending on, you'll see that there's different levels of cost on the type of project. You can invest in building solar projects or windmills or other things, tree planting, reforestation projects. But typically it's somewhere around $20 to $30 a ton. And so for $50, $60 a month, it's estimated that one can offset typical typical emissions. And so certainly an important thing to consider doing as we also try to reduce our emissions as much as we can. So one of the questions that I'm going to ask you to be thinking about in the small group coming up is, if these are the kinds of changes that are needed, what do we need for those changes to become possible, right? So what kinds of changes might we need in our worldview, in our culture, in our spirituality to get us to actually undertake these changes and to get these transformations that are required? And lastly, just wanted to ask the question, in a kind of theological context, in addition to hope that we may find in seeing the things that are being done and can be done, are there deeper grounds of our hope, or what enables us to keep going when we see that carbon emissions have gone up? We are about 1 minute from the end. That carbon emissions have gone up since the signing of the Paris Climate Accords, right? That can be a very despairing thing to see and to understand. I mean, the positive thing about that is they've gone up a lot less than they would have gone up if we didn't do all the things that have already been done. But all the things that have been done so far haven't even been enough to begin to bring the levels of overall emissions down. So it can be overwhelming sometimes to face the depths of the crisis that we're in. And so where are some of the deeper sources of hope? And Pope Francis talks about what he calls resurrection hope, right? The sense of God's power at work in the world. And he has this to say: when all seems to be dead, signs of the resurrection suddenly spring up. It is an irresistible force. Often it seems that God does not exist. All around us, we see persistent injustice, evil, indifference, and cruelty. But it is also true that in the midst of darkness, something new always springs to life. On raised land, life breaks through, stubbornly yet invincibly. Each day in our world, beauty is born anew. And I think for me that the importance of contemplative practices of how do we maintain hope, how do we look honestly at the world, and something that I try to integrate into my classes as we spend our time looking at the world's crises, are practices of mindfulness, practices of meditation, practices of prayer, that all the traditions of the contemplative mystical traditions of the world tell us that at the heart of reality is this overwhelming compassion, this overwhelming love that we can come in contact with and that can sustain us even in difficult and challenging times. And so I thought I'd end just with a couple quotes from one contemplative, George Fox, who's one of the founders of the Quaker tradition, but I think has a couple really powerful quotes. This one was actually written to early Quakers who were in jail. Many early Quakers ended up in jail for going against the customs of their time in various ways. But he has this to say: "Sing and rejoice, ye children of the day and of the light, for the Lord is at work in this thick night of darkness that may be felt." I think that's such a powerful phrase. Sing and rejoice, for the Lord is at work in this thick night of darkness that may be felt. And truth doth flourish as the rose, and lilies do grow among the thorns, and the plants atop the hills, and upon them the lambs do skip and play. And never heed the tempest, nor the storms, floods nor rains, for the seed Christ is over all, and doth reign. And he also said this: "I saw that there was an ocean of darkness and death, but an infinite ocean of light and love, which flowed over the ocean of darkness. And in that, I saw the infinite love of God." And I think that the contemplative practices can help us be in touch with that ocean of light and love, and then the kind of interconnectedness that flows from that experience, right? That one of the themes over and over in the Laudato Si is the need to see that everything is connected. And it's one thing to see that intellectually, or to understand that intellectually. It's another thing to actually have that experience, right? It's the heart of Buddhism. It's the heart of other traditions, is saying that that kind of spiritual breakthrough is realizing that we're not separate, right? Thich Nhat Hanh talks about our task is to overcome the illusion of separateness, right? And that's what can lead us to do the kinds of things that can save the world from where we may be headed. Anyway, sorry for going. I think I went overtime. I don't know how much overtime I went, but anyway, we will, I think, move into the small group. How do we do that?
Thank you, John. You gave us a few things to think about. So now we are going to move into our small group discussions. And so if you would get with some people maybe you don't know. If you're watching on the live stream, now's the time to join the Zoom room. The link was emailed out and is also available in the YouTube video description. So please spend the next 13, 15 minutes. I'll give you a 1-minute warning. Discussing, so in the chapel questions on here, there's a first question, and then the question John put up is the second question on that sheet. And then like I say, I'll give you a little warning when we're ready to come back to Q&A period, okay? Thank you. Thank you, John.
I think he may be controlling it. I think he controls it back there. I think he'll turn it on.
Another minute, and we'll gather for Q&A.
Sense of how the registrations are going for the retreats?
We were up to 45. That was Sunday. He announced, did he announce it at our last meeting? 45. So, and then some more invitation tonight. So I don't know. But it's supposed to be a pretty lousy day. Rain and cold. All this great weather we've had. I don't think it's going to be as bad as today was cold-wise. Oh, that's right. Yeah. Okay, if I could draw you back. I know. I've done a lot of. Dan Roach, sit down. Dan Roach. Dan Roach. Dan Roach, would you go sit down, please?
Yes, he's a I'd be happy to.
I know from long ago he's a rebel rouser. Can't you control him? Okay. Before we take any questions, maybe from each group, a little sense of what you talked about, the impact, any ideas of what you're going to. Oh, that's right. We have to pass this around. Okay. I'll just come out. Anybody? Who wants? Oh, are you going to make your announcement? Not yet. Not yet. No, not yet. I'm watching the time. Anybody want to? Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, we started off talking about despair and how it didn't seem like things were happening and looking at the charts and everything like that. And then we moved on to talking about what we were doing in our own lives. And one of the things that I mentioned was that elections have consequences. And so you need to be having that in your mind when you're choosing people who are making decisions. And we ended up with asking, what's Xavier doing? We heard that Creighton was doing stuff, and Georgetown and Loyola, and you know, do we know, is Xavier having any plans on becoming carbon neutral or that?
Yeah, I don't know if you want me to respond or if you want to hear from other groups or first.
We'll hold that, and then John will respond to that. Yes. And your next slide, bold voting. Yes, right here.
Well, after some similar despair, we wrapped up with the idea of the importance of hope. And hope in our own lives individually, and hope more broadly speaking, because that can motivate people to act.
Thank you. Anybody else want to? Yes, please.
We had some really neat people in our group that were already doing some pretty great things.
Go ahead.
Well, we lived with geothermal heating for almost 40 years. We got in on it when it was first becoming popular, or not even becoming popular. I think we were the only house in town that had it. We lived in Sydney, Ohio, and it was marvelous. We had two wells, one that took the water up and one that put the water back into the system. And it also heated all of our water that we used in the home. And I really miss it. We moved to Cincinnati about 7 years ago, and we live right in town with all these houses together and couldn't have it here. But I do really miss it. It's a wonderful, wonderful way, a system to heat and cool your home. No, there's no, what do you call that thing outside? Condenser. You don't have a condenser with it or anything. Okay. Well, you tell yours.
I drive an electric vehicle, and I find most people don't like it because they can't find charger stations or they have range anxiety. And I get 240 miles before I need to charge. So I drive to Kansas City to visit my son, and I'll drive 240 miles, and then I'll have lunch and charge my car, and then I can drive 240 miles, and then I'll stay overnight and charge it at a Holiday Inn. And so wherever I go, I can find chargers. I can go to Kansas City, and there's 12 different chargers, fast chargers on the way to Kansas City. I can go to Washington, D.C. to visit my daughter. I can go anywhere, but I find some dead spots here and there. I can't go out to Upper Michigan, to the UP, because they don't have enough chargers. So they're coming. They'll be here in the next 2 or 3 years. But chargers are fairly easy to find. And I love your story.
Some people here already know it, but we built a passive solar home and put very simple collector boxes on the roof for hot water. And it's very simple. 2 little pumps. One pumps antifreeze through the collectors. We had about 80 square feet of collectors for that. And the other one pumps water from the bottom of the water heater up to a set of pipes. And the antifreeze runs concentric or inside of the water. And the heat transfers about 85%. So once we had even just a semi-sunny day, the pipes would be so hot, if you touched me, it would burn your hands. And you know, the rubber insulation, it would melt that. There was only a certain kind that it would not melt. So it works. And the
Insulation, yes.
insulation on the
Okay,
house.
three active people here. Lynn, I'm going to come over here and make sure you get your little announcement in. I'm trying to watch my time.
I have Crow.
The Crow, and was one of the presenters at our water panel last time.
My friend was Susan. Yeah, Crow. Citizens for the Rights of the Ohio River Watershed. Tomorrow in front of City Hall on the steps, we are having a kickoff at 11 a.m. If you're around on your coffee break, please come down and hear about our petition. It's a petition to insert the rights of the Ohio River, which means great river. It means beautiful river in the original language, pronounced Ohio. It's been around a long time, way before us. And we use it as a toilet, and we don't need that anymore. We don't deserve that. We want to protest against it, and this petition will be shot down by the legislature or whoever, the courts, but they can't shut us up. They can't destroy a vision. This is an imagining of a better, cleaner Ohio River, the watershed. It connects us to Pittsburgh, to East Palestine, Youngstown. We're all connected by the watershed, by the land, by the air we breathe. We are one, and at the same time, we are many. So it's a contradiction, but it's physics, it's science. We are one and we are many, and because of that, we can get this done. Even though they fight us and say, no, you can't do that. Well, yes, we can, because there's more of us. And we don't care, we care about people, not profits. We care about nature.
So you have a petition for us?
Yes, anybody that's a registered voter of Cincinnati, thank you. Please do sign, or else we'll be around at Earth Days. We'll be around. We only need a little over 5,000 signatures, so do be the ones who get this signed, because our voices need to be heard.
And you'll be in the back to sign this? And you've got your petition there to sign? Okay. So before you leave, if you want to sign that. Online. Oh. Oh.
All right, online we have, it looks like some people wanted to know, Duke offers options for supporting green energy. Is this real, or is there anything useful from what Duke can offer?
Okay, I'm on. Okay.
They said they couldn't hear you on that one. Okay, just speak into that.
That's a good question. I'm not certain what Duke is offering right now. I mean, I know the city of Cincinnati is part of the aggregation program where they purchase some local solar. They also purchase renewable energy credits from other places. So if you live within the city of Cincinnati and haven't opted out of that, you are part of, broadly speaking, a green energy program. There's some limits to renewable energy credits in terms of, it's not necessarily have the same impact as directly getting the local renewable energy, but it's supporting renewable energy more broadly. So that aggregation program is a good thing. But I'm not sure what Duke could be offering in addition to that, as an alternative to that.
I can talk to them later.
Okay.
John, do you want to, can you say anything to Damon's question about what Xavier's doing?
Yeah, so actually, I guess I'll respond to a number of the questions. So I think I heard a common theme of despair. and I think it is important to see that a lot of the changes that are coming are just in their early stages, right? So I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, which doesn't sound like it has a lot to do with climate change, but it's actually, a bulk of that actually has to do with climate change. But it is estimated that just the impacts of that alone will reduce US greenhouse emissions somewhere between, you'll see a range of figures, but somewhere around 30 to 40% by, I believe, 2030 already. So I mean, in a seven-year period. And similarly, you have a lot of other countries that have made commitments. So the goal that many are trying to get to is a 50% reduction by 2030 and carbon neutral by 2050. So that's kind of the kind of commonly agreed upon kind of framework. And it's possible that the US could meet its commitments to that with the combination of what was in the Inflation Reduction Act, added to that if the new EPA proposals around transportation get fully implemented, that it's estimated that would get to somewhere around that 50%. Now the first 50% is going to be easier in some ways than the second 50% getting to 100, but it's it's an important step in the right direction. And that legislation was just passed a year ago, right? So we haven't seen the impacts of that. And that's similar in other countries as well that are making significant commitments. Now, if you add up all the commitments that are currently committed to, though, the scientists will still say we're still falling far short of what's needed, but it's a step in a positive direction. It's also why the follow-up negotiations to the Paris Climate Accord are now happening every year, right? That they're having and asking for stronger commitments each year, recognizing that the commitments that have been made aren't strong enough, but that over time they can be increased. So the fact that things haven't gotten a lot better since the signing of the Paris Climate Accords is a little bit misleading because some of the things take a little bit of time to ramp up. Of course, in the United States, we have an administration that sort of went in the opposite direction that is being recovered from in terms of the climate impacts. So there are hopeful things that are happening. And the ways that all the things that were being talked about that people already are doing, that as more and more people begin to understand those possibilities and to see that, like solar, I mean, the cost of solar now is down about 90% from what it was a decade or two ago. I've seen a study that they looked at the cost of maintaining all the coal plants that are still in existence, or just simply straight out closing them down and replacing them with renewable. And except for one coal plant in all the United States, they found that it would actually be cheaper for the utilities to just transition and not try to keep those coal plants going. So, I mean, as that economic reality sets in, and as these incentives set in from the Inflation Reduction Act that are sort of giving more reasons for people to move in those positive directions, I think we will see, those changing. But it's also not a reason for any complacency, right? Because we need even more than what's committed to. We need to make sure that there's not backtracking on that and that commitments are really followed through on. In terms of Xavier, it's at an even earlier stage in some sense this past year there was a Laudato Si action plan steering committee that was formed that a number of us here are part of, including Paige, and came up with lots of great ideas. We've basically been told, talk about your ideas again and see what you can do without needing money or significant resources. So that's because the university is dealing with a budget deficit. And so the question of how much will really come out of that is unclear, but there have been a lot of people working on a variety of different subcommittees of what can be done. On the divestment, there really hasn't been anything done. One of the subcommittees is looking at that issue, but there were also a variety of other possibilities that are being pursued, one of which actually would be a project that Bellarmine would sponsor for putting some solar panels on campus and at least beginning that process and trying to get some permission from the university to look into that and figure out a site for that. So a number, the roof here is a little odd for putting solar panels on. So that's one of the challenges is where would you put things. But so there is some conversation going on around a variety of these things and folks trying to work on them, but it's unclear exactly what will actually come out of it.
One of my jobs is timekeeper here, so I want to thank you, John, for your presentation. I think there were enough things to be hopeful about, but
Thank you all for
this
being
is our
here.
last presentation for our Embracing God's Creation series for this time around. Our series ends, though, this coming Saturday, April 22nd, which is International Earth Day, with a retreat out at the Jesuit Spiritual Center. So if you have not signed up and you're interested, there is still time to sign up. And just a note that you can tell people that they can go online or go to the website, Bellarmine's website, to get the live stream of tonight's presentation. And one last announcement for the people here in the chapel. There's some goodies out on the table, as has been our custom with our in-person programs, our series. So thank you again for coming tonight, and thanks again, John.